I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. Before I continue with this next part, I want to go ahead and say that I deeply regret doing the things I did when I was younger, and I don't condone breaking the law or doing the kind of things that I did back then. But anyways, I used to break into people's houses or garages and I would steal whatever I could find for food money, or really whatever I wanted to spend it on. I should also mention that I lived in a very bad part of Nashville, by the way, but I would stay with my grandparents who had custody of my older brother on the weekends. Well, this particular weekend when I was about 13, I was going through some people's backyards looking for unlocked cars or garages. Well, I happened to notice a back door was open, about 4 or 5 inches with no lights on anywhere downstairs. So being the 13-year-old kid that I was, I go into the house. And while tiptoeing through the house trying to steal stuff like TVs and game systems, as well as computers, I heard a high-pitched scream, but it was muffled, if you can understand what I'm saying. Well, that stopped me dead in my tracks and caused me to listen way more intently. After the muffled scream, I had heard a slap and what sounded like someone then telling them, "Don't bother screaming, because nobody can hear you screaming down here." So I slowly start walking towards the screams, and I found a door cracked open that led to the basement, and I could tell there was a light on in the basement. I end up laying on the floor and looking down the steps towards the center of the basement, and I see that a man and a woman are tied up to some chairs in the basement, and both are gagged. The difference was that the man had his head hanging limp, and he had blood all over his chest, and he didn't even look like he was breathing. When I saw this, I got really scared, and then I took off running, making all kinds of noise. I know that it was loud enough for the intruder downstairs to hear me and freak out and start running up after me, but I just ran as fast as possible out the front door. I didn't even bother unlocking the screen door. I just ran right through it and ran down to the corner house, where I knew the owner was a firefighter. I start beating on his door, screaming for help, that there's a man chasing me trying to kill me like he did the neighbor. Well, this really freaked out the homeowner and it caused him to pull out a weapon on me first, until he noticed the deranged man running behind me at full speed, who had a matchet in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. Without saying a word, the fireman opened fire, and he shot the guy in his leg, which caused him to fall, and it also caused the kitchen knife to go right through his own neck. I believe that actually killed him on sight. I never heard him make any noises, but I was making enough for myself at the moment. The fireman called the police before heading towards the neighbor's house that the man came from, and he then found the wife barely clinging to her own life. But unfortunately, the husband was pronounced dead on the scene. What I heard around the neighborhood afterwards was that the husband had been in a car accident about 6 months before this, and the said crazy man's wife had apparently died in that car wreck. This caused the man to go crazy and start drinking and doing drugs until he just didn't care about living, and he just wanted everyone to suffer like he and his wife had. So he went to the man's house and he tortured him and his wife for hours until he passed out from the pain. The intruder slit the husband's throat, and before chasing me, he slit the wife's throat as well. But luckily, the paramedics were able to save her when they arrived. So yeah, kids, don't break into other people's homes. You just might stumble onto something that you can't get out of. The apartment complex was beautiful. It was a smaller complex located right in the heart of a quiet and nestled community. Most of the residents in the complex were older folks that were retired and just didn't need the space of an entire house. When I was moving into the building, I noticed another young person like me watching from one of the windows. It was a beautiful girl, someone that personally I would consider to be out of my league. Unfortunately, my career didn't allow for much dating. After moving in, I noticed that often. I would come or go from the parking lot and I would see the woman looking at me. I just assumed that she was nosy or something like that, and I didn't think for 1 second that she had any interest in me. Down the road from the complex was a grocery store that was very convenient to stop in on my way home from work. One afternoon after work, when I stopped in the store to grab some dinner, I ended up physically running into the girl who had been staring at me for a few days now, and I literally mean and we physically collided with each other. I was turning into an aisle with my head on my phone and she was walking out of the aisle. In a nervous voice she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I'm just an idiot sometimes." I started to say it was okay, but stopped when I realized who it was. Once everything clicked, I said, "Hey, are you the girl that lives in my building?" She started to smile and blush and then said, "Yeah, that's me." I'm usually the one who gets nervous and blushes uncontrollably in these kinds of situations, so it was nice that the heat was on someone else for a change. She made some comments about her stupid cheeks turning red, and I responded by telling her that in high school my friends used to call me a cherry pie because my face was always red. We both laughed as I diffused the tension. We made small talk for a little while right there in the store, and then that evolved into a real conversation. Finally, I worked up the courage to ask if she wanted to come over for dinner tonight since we were practically neighbors. She smiled and looked thrilled by that offer. She accepted and said that she would be over at around 7, and we exchanged numbers and about our shopping. I was so excited and nervous about my date with this very attractive neighbor that I had. I realized that I only had about an hour to clean my apartment and get ready. I hadn't had a real date since my freshman year of college over 4 years ago, so I was admittedly a train wreck in my mind. I even remember while I was cleaning the apartment, I got a text from her that said I can't wait for tonight with a heart. Before I knew it, it was set and she was knocking on my door. The first several hours were amazing. We talked, ate dinner, had some wine, and just had a great evening. I felt like this was my first real adult date, and I was proud of how it was unfolding. Late in the evening, I was ready for bed, and this was a weeknight, and I had to work the next day, and I could tell that she wanted to stay, but I made it clear that I wasn't ready for anything further than this. She was understanding, and we said goodnight at around 11 p.m. when I walked to her door, which sat about 30 feet from my door. I kissed her goodnight, and she smiled. I walked inside my apartment with an overwhelming feeling of joy and happiness. I woke up at around 3 a.m. that morning just to use the bathroom, then I noticed something weird as I walked into the hall, and the light that was shining under the door to my apartment was a shadow like someone was standing in front of my door. I figured it was my tired eyes just playing tricks on me, so I didn't worry too much. After the bathroom, when I walked by the door again, I noticed that the obstruction to the light was still there. I quietly went over to the door and looked through the peephole in the door, and standing right outside my door was the girl that I had just shared an entire evening with. She looked like she was mumbling something under her breath, but I wasn't sure. If I ever looked through one of those holes, they're not very clear sometimes, so I watched for a few seconds, and she didn't move at all. I snuck back into my room and grabbed my phone. I made sure that it was silent and went back to the door, and I texted her phone and said, "Hey, I can't sleep, but I just wanted to let you know that I had a great time tonight." Seconds later, she grabbed her phone from her pocket, and with no expression on her face, she responded with me too with an exclamation point, "I can't wait to see you again." I waited for a moment and then sent another text that said, "I'm surprised you're awake. What are you up to?" Her response turned the butterflies in my stomach to stone when she responded with, "Oh, just laying in bed watching Netflix." I couldn't understand why she was standing there and lying about it. I didn't respond to her text right away. I had no idea what to say to this woman or how to approach a situation like this. While I was thinking of something to say, she texted me again, this time saying, "If you want, I can come back or you can come here." The text was followed by a bunch of emojis. I started to type a response but kept deleting whatever I typed. While I was typing, she texted me again and said, "You have nothing to be afraid of," and that text hit me differently for some reason. I finally sent a simple text that just read, "Thanks for the offer, but I'm really tired." I looked through the hole as she read the message, and still with no expression on her face, she put the phone back in her pocket and looked right at the peephole. I knew she couldn't see me, but the horror that I felt when I sort of made eye contact with the woman through the door was almost indescribable. The look on her face was not the same look I had just admired that evening prior. Her eyes looked cold, and I have no idea what her intentions were, but I just felt like they weren't good. I know I'm not good at dating, but I do know standing outside someone's door in the middle of the night motionless is not normal behavior. I decided to text her one last time and said, "Hey, did you hear anything funny in the hall? I thought I heard a knock on my door." This was my poor attempt to try and fish something out of her, or at least elicit some reaction. She looked at the text for a minute, then back at the peephole with her cold eyes as if though she knew I was there, and without moving from her position, she texted me one last time that said, "You're a smart boy, very smart, sleep tight." She put her head back down, and after about 5 minutes of just standing there, she turned around and went back to her apartment. She looked like she had something tucked in the back of her pants, but looking through the peephole, this could have just been my imagination, so I wasn't sure. I texted her the next day, and she never responded. Even though she lived a few doors down, I never did run into her again. I left a note for her one time and slipped it under her door and still never heard from her. I never told the apartment management because I didn't really think anything could be done. It was an unnerving and terrifying experience for me, but I had no proof other than a few text messages that didn't show anything legal or really make any sense. I never saw her again, which is insane considering that I lived at this apartment for 6 months after this experience. The curtains were always shut when I would get home from work, and I never crossed paths with her in the hallway. Now I know the story isn't your typical "oh god, I'm gonna die" story, but to put yourself in my shoes, I guarantee you wouldn't want to be me. The memory of that look in her eyes still haunts me to this day. Friends have always joked with me that she probably was just looking for some adult companionship, but I promise you this was different. Be careful out there because you never know what kind of intentions people have deep down. So this happened last year when I was house sitting for my neighbor. He was in the hospital for a few days recovering from surgery, and I had been asked to stay in the house to keep an eye on his cats. The house was pretty small, but it was on a nice wide open property by the woods, and there was a tiny swinging cat flap on the kitchen door where the cats could come and go as they pleased. The flap led into a screened-in back porch, and the house only had one bedroom, so I chose to sleep on the couch in the living room. After cleaning up, feeding the cats, and watching some TV, I shut off all the lights and lay back on the couch. I had my phone out and was casually scrolling through Facebook when I heard the flap, swinging back and forth. From where I was in the living room, I couldn't see the door, because the counter was in the way, but I glanced over to see where the cat scampered over and leap up on my legs. I gave it a welcoming pat on the head and continued scrolling. After another minute, I heard the cat door make a noise again, a soft squeak. This time I didn't even glance over, figuring it was the second cat following the first into the house. Another few moments passed and I heard the squeaking again, and after another moment it squeaked a third time. I looked up from my phone wondering why the second cat was jumping in and out like that. I was wondering if I would have to scoop it up and put it in the bedroom. The door continued to squeak for another couple of minutes as the second cat continued to jump in and out. I finally decided that I had enough. I put my phone down and sat up on the couch. I began to stretch. As I did, I happened to glance behind the couch and my blood froze. The second cat was curled up in its bed in the corner, and the first cat was still nestled between my legs. My confusion turned to fear instantly. Was there another animal on the back porch? Another cat, maybe? I slowly stood up and carefully made my way over to the back door, tiptoeing across the carpet in my socks. The door made a squeaking noise again. I peered around the counter and felt the sensation of my heart leaping up into my throat, and at the same moment my stomach dropped. By the faint rays of the nightlight in the hallway, I saw an arm reaching through the cat door, straining to get at the knob. The fingertips were brushing at the lock. For a few short seconds, all I could do was stare in terror, frozen by the surreal silent reality of what I was experiencing. It almost didn't feel real. The severity of the situation hit me, and I realized that if the intruder got in, I wasn't going to stand a chance. I grabbed a large two-pronged fork that was used for flipping steaks on a grill, and in one swift motion, I stabbed at the arm right below the wrist as hard as I could. There came a thunderous scream of pain from the other side of the door, and the arm was immediately retracted through the flap. But the fork had impaled the intruder, so it caught itself on the door. That produced a second loud scream, and the arm was wrenched violently outside. I heard the clatter of the fork on the ground, and then I heard footsteps sprint across the back porch and out the screen door. I immediately turned on the outside lights and caught the glimpse of a figure running towards the woods. Instead of calling the cops, I scooped up both cats, stuffed them into the same carrier, grabbed my phone, my shoes, and sprinted out to my car, which was thankfully parked inside the garage. I drove up the road a couple of miles to my place, and once I was safely inside, I called the cops. It took them half an hour to get to my place, and then another half hour of questioning before they continued down the road to check out my neighbor's house. They told me that there was no sign that the screen door had been broken into, and aside from the bloodstains, there was no sign of the intruder. They put out an alert to local hospitals for a man with a stab wound on his right arm. The following morning, the police brought a dog out to follow the scent, but whoever the lucky bastard was, he was never caught. I kept the cats at my place until my neighbor was out of the hospital. It still shakes me to my soul. The idea that the stranger chose that house in the middle of nowhere trying to get inside, and if I hadn't got off the couch when I did, this may have ended very differently. Me and my family just recently moved to our new house. My dad bought it in an auction. The house was actually better than any of the previous ones we had lived in. It had a big pool in the backside and a small garden beside the pool too. There was a big tree in the garden which grew scented yellow flowers. The backside is probably the only reason why I agreed to move into the house. The house was also close to my school, hence my parents were happy about the safety measures. Both of my parents traveled a lot, so I got accustomed to staying alone in the house from quite a young age. We had tight securities and alarms all around this new house too. There was no way anyone could break in without setting off the alarm, so I had nothing to worry about. At the back of the house, there stood an old 3-story apartment. I would always see people on the first and second floor, but the third floor felt like no one stayed there. The third story's bedroom windows faced directly at the backside of our house. It was a calm and quiet place, so I kind of liked chilling in my house while my parents were on tour. One weekend, my parents were off to visit my step-aunt-in-law. I stayed back home like usual. It was a Saturday night, and all my friends wanted to hang out at one of my other friends' house. I promised my parents not to stay out late, so after a couple of beers, I came back home. It was 9 p.m. and I wasn't feeling sleepy at all. I went upstairs and got in my bathing suit to go for a swim in the pool. It was a hot summer night. I poured myself a glass of fresh orange juice and put on some music. I swam for some time and then I drank my juice lying on my pool raft. I must have fallen asleep. I heard a noise and I woke up. The backside of the apartment was all empty. No one was around. Just then, my eyes went to the third floor window of the nearby building. A frail old woman was standing in front of the window looking directly at me. Her eyes were so big that her stare kind of freaked me out. I didn't say anything and looked at my watch. It was around 10 p.m. I just continued to lie on my raft, thinking she would leave on her own. After a couple of minutes, when I looked back, she wasn't there on the window. I felt relieved and kept thinking, how come I never saw her before? I almost thought that no one lived on the third floor apartment. That's when I heard my phone ringing. It was inside the house, so I got up out of the pool, thinking it was my parents calling. I was just about to step inside when I heard a voice come from behind me. I froze. It was an old woman's voice. I slowly turned back, and my heart drowned in horror. That old, creepy woman was standing right behind me. There was no way she could have gotten in my backyard without breaking in. Her wide, cold death stare made my legs. No. I literally couldn't walk away, even though I wanted to so badly. I spoke in a broken voice. Ma'am, how did you get inside? She slightly opened her toothless mouth and said, Isabel, are you still here? Run away now or your husband will come and bury you there. She then lifted her weak, lean hand and pointed towards the tree in our garden with her long, creepy fingers. My blood turned to ice. I replied in a shaky voice, What are you saying? She didn't answer. She just kept staring at the tree and then back to my face. Her mouth opened and her eyes widened. It was such a horrible sight. Suddenly, my phone again rang, and I ran towards my room frantically this time. I got inside my room and locked it. It was my dad. I answered the phone and stood sobbing terribly. My dad got all freaked out and called 911 on my behalf. The cops came after 10 minutes, and I told them an old, crazy lady from the nearby apartment entered our backyard and said some very bizarre things to me. They immediately went to the apartment building and asked the landlord about his tenants on the third floor. It came out as a shock when the landlord said that that floor of the apartment had been empty for the last 15 years. But he also said that an old lady used to live on that floor way back in the day. She was sick and bedridden, so she spent most of her time sitting near that window inside the dark room, and that her children left her alone during her last days. She even died sitting near that window. The landlord himself did her cremation rituals. The next morning when my parents came, I told them everything, and a lady cop also stood back with me in the house from last night. She also explained to my parents that I might have just had a bad dream or something. But while they were talking, something popped into my mind. I asked my dad what was the name of the previous owner of our house. He replied, saying the bank told him a woman lived here with her husband in the house before we moved in. But he also added that that was 15 years ago, and he asked why I was asking. My heart started to beat faster. I told the cop that the old woman addressed me as Isabel and said her husband buried her under that tree. They both looked pretty surprised, and the cop even decided to check our backyard. When they dug under the tree, scaring the hell out of everyone, a skeleton of a full-grown woman got discovered from our garden. It had a ring on its left hand. Me, along with my mom and my dad, are all completely paranoid. We never knew that there was a dead body lying in our garden. The cops investigated this matter, and they came to know that indeed it was a woman named Isabel's remains. Her husband filed a missing persons report, but after filing the report, he too left the house and the town. Due to the lack of evidence, the police couldn't find any details about her. Also, no one came to interrogate him about her. Her autopsy report signified that she was murdered by a serious injury made by a blunt object on the back of her head. The cops instantly suspected it was her husband who murdered her and had buried her under that tree. And to this day, they're still searching for her husband. I am almost positive that that old lady saw this entire incident from her room's window, but couldn't tell anyone. Even though people find it hard to believe, I think she came back to tell me about it, and I believe it was her ghost that I saw that night. But the question that kept eating my mind was, why me? But this too got answered when the cops published Isabel's picture in the local newspaper, stating about the gruesome case. My parents are still in deep shock. I have no idea what to say. Isabel looks exactly like me. Or should I say, I look exactly like her. We're still living in the same house to this day, but I haven't seen that old lady ever again.